able to guarantee basic human rights to all the citizens and residents of India and Pakistan? What kind of securities do we have? How are we safeguarding our future? What do we mean by nuclear armament in our respective countries? We are very happy to have two great scholars, Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy and Dr. Angana Chatterji, who will help us think through these issues and engage in some discussion. The way we're going to have this today is that we're going to start with Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy, who will talk a little bit about the movie. Hopefully we'll have the audio set up by then. And then we'll be able to show the documentary, Pakistan and India Under Nuclear Shadow. And we'll follow that up with a talk by Dr. Angana Chatterji. And then we'll have a question-answer session right at the end. So we won't be taking question-answers during the talks, but we're going to have a discussion, an open discussion session at the end. So save your questions till then. And before I let Dr. Hoodbhoy speak, being an Indian, it's difficult for me to give up the podium. I wanted to tell you a little bit about FOSA. I'm sure all of you already know everything there is to know about FOSA, but I still wanted to have my 2 cents worth. FOSA started last year in January 2002, when the tensions between India and Pakistan were at an all-time high. It so happened that a group of people, independently unknown to each other, within a week, organized 2 separate peace vigils for India and Pakistan. Thanks to Yahoo and thanks to Akhila Raman, we actually linked up with each other and then formed a joint organization, Friends of South Asia, which is what the character of the organization is today. Since then, we held a number of peace vigils. We've held a number of talks and discussions on a wide variety of topics, ranging from communal tensions in India to artistic freedoms in Pakistan, to the Ahmadiyya movement and the problems with it in India and Pakistan. I think a crowning achievement was when we decided to screen a film called Garam Hawa, which, as some of you might know, is a film on the partition of the subcontinent in 1947. When we were planning this event, there was a lot of discussion going around this event and all the Bay Area email lists. Stanford India, there was a discussion going on in Stanford India, how we as a group are anti-India and pro-Pakistan. Simultaneously, there was a discussion going on in Silicon Valley Pakistan lists about how we as a group are always bashing Pakistan and loving India. The loving India and Pakistan part we really like, that's why we are friends. As far as bashing goes, I want to make it clear we are an equal opportunity basher. We bash everybody we want to, all countries we're associated with, India, Pakistan, the US, and every issue we don't like. We would like to increase our purview and also include bashing Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Maldives, but we don't have that opportunity so far. We don't have volunteers from there. We have a sign-up sheet over there. I really encourage people to sign up and join our group and discussions therewith. I think that's all I have to say about that right now. So to introduce Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy, most of you. Oh yes, thanks Zuli for reminding. If anyone of you have cell phones, could you please turn it off, because it is a royal nuisance once we start the event. But Dr. Hoodbhoy, as most of you know, he is a very well-known peace activist from Pakistan. He also happens to be a professor of physics at Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad, and he is here for a research fellowship at the SLAC, the Stanford University Accelerator. He has written and spoken extensively about nuclear disarmament, but besides that, he has also done a lot of work on the education system in Pakistan and science in Islam. In fact, one of the first essays I read by him was an essay called Salam, Science and Secularism, which I still think is a fantastic essay, and all of you should read it. It's widely available on the internet. He has produced a 13-part documentary series in Urdu for the Pakistan television on critical issues in education. And he's also authored Islam and Science, Religion, Orthodoxy, and Battle for Rationality. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to him.
Thank you, Shalini, for this very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here and have this opportunity of meeting so many of you. Many people I'm meeting for the first time. They're also old friends. It's a delight to meet them. I'm sorry this has started off a little late, but we'll get around to it, I'm sure. A little bit about the film. You're going to see it. It's about 30 minutes in duration. But let me tell you a little bit about why we made it. In going to schools, colleges and universities in Pakistan, many of us felt that only words were not good enough, and that if there were pictures to back it up with, that would be so much better. So the idea of creating a video arose in our minds, and so I looked around for a possible collaborative venture with people in India, because ideally when you talk about nuclear issues between India and Pakistan and how to handle the nuclear issue, it should be done from both ends. So I did look around and came to the conclusion that it was far too difficult in logistical terms, simply because it is next to impossible to go across the border for me, being a government employee. You see, being a professor at a state university makes me a government employee. And even if I was not, to have collaboration on an issue that is as sensitive as the nuclear issue would have been much too difficult. And so I, to my great regret, had to give up on that idea. And so then I looked around for professional producers who might be willing to produce a documentary on the nuclear issue in Pakistan. And I went to several of them, and they looked at me with incredulity and said, "You want us to do that?" And it turned out that it was also very, very difficult. And so therefore I said, all right, if nobody else will do it, then why don't I take a bash at it? So that's how this came about. The footage that I use in the documentary came from various different sources. In fact, I wouldn't really like to tell you where I got all of it, because some of those places were I think not to be talked about over here. Anyway, making the documentary was one part, and then getting it to be seen was another. Now certainly, while making it, I was under no illusion that this would not be aired by Pakistan television, or for that matter, by Indian television, because the message that it contains would be unpalatable to both. And indeed, in spite of efforts to get it aired on a private television channel in Pakistan, that didn't work out either. Nevertheless, it has achieved substantial circulation, and there have been well over, I'd say, 200 viewings. Some of those viewings have had audiences as large as 1,000, and on one occasion 2,000. Other occasions have been more like this. I think a more manageable audience. We have also used it extensively in going to schools, colleges and universities, as was the original plan. And the Urdu version of this, actually this was first made in Urdu. What you will see is the English version, which was made almost simultaneously with that. You know, it's the same footage, but just the language, the soundtrack is different. The Urdu version was broadcast in Canada. Now there is a fairly big Urdu-speaking community over there, and so that came across very well over there. And then also in Dubai, and there was an Arabic version which was also broadcast in the Middle East. So I just wanted to say these few things by way of introduction. When you see the movie, you will naturally want to ask questions or make comments upon it, so I'll end over here. But just one thing before ending. This was made approximately 2 months before September 11th, the event which is supposed to have changed the world. In retrospect, if I were to make the movie again, I probably wouldn't make it very much differently. The arguments, the content would remain substantially the same, except in one major respect. And I'll leave you to guess that, and we'll discuss that at the end of the movie. So with these words, I stop and let's see if the audio works. Just about enough for 2 weeks of imports. But then, after joining the US-led coalition, the World Bank, foreign donors, the United States, they made, how should I say, generous contributions. But more than that, there was another phenomenon that led to Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves growing enormously. The fissile material facilities, Gahuta, and other places in Pakistan now, are working on 3 8-hour shifts a day, so that makes it 24 hours, and there are simply not more hours there, otherwise they've used those as well. And I'm sure that in India the reactors are running just about as fast as they possibly can so that they can reprocess the plutonium from that. New types of missiles are being developed, and the old ones have gone into production line, and they have in fact been deployed. We are also now learning that an anti-ballistic missile is being sought by India with the help of Israel and the United States. And this is actually a quantum, when this comes through, this will be a quantum escalation. Because as we know from the Cold War experience, that when one side develops the capability to thwart the other, then it creates a situation of panic on the other side. And this is precisely why the US and the Soviet Union entered into the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM, which was, of course, scrapped by George Bush. And now we have the National Missile Defense, and that's going as fast as possibly can at the moment. So this new destabilizing element has already entered, or is shortly about to enter into the India-Pakistan equation. What we saw last year was the fourth crisis, the fourth nuclear crisis, and this was perhaps the most extended one that we've ever had. And that was for something like 9 months. You had nearly 1 million men, soldiers on both sides, engaged in eyeball-to-eyeball contact, and it was very fortunate, of course, that nothing happened. But what I found most alarming during that whole episode was that, there wasn't too much concern. There's very little concern in our countries. People outside were extremely worried. You had leaders from the US, Britain, China, France, Russia coming to Islamabad, going on to Delhi, and there's a continuous stream of very high-level people coming across to defuse the nuclear tension, but nobody cared at our end. I mean, the schools which normally close, whenever it rains more than half an inch, or something perfectly minor happens, the schools didn't close. The stock market was not affected. Nobody was stocking up on food, and it was a non-event. What is happening on the borders? Let me tell you why I find it so alarming. The reason is that, look, nuclear deterrence, if it is to work, I say, and of course I think it worked 4 times. The fact that we didn't go to war is evidence that it did work. Then, behind nuclear deterrence is fear. If you're not afraid of the other side, then it doesn't work. And we are losing that fear. Why are we losing that fear? Well, I don't know. But it may be It's very possible that it's because we've played too often on the brink. Actually, the psychologists have done studies of this, that the more times a gambler, they did this study in Las Vegas, the more times a gambler takes high risk, the easier it is for him the next time to take a high risk again. And so, we have started gambling. Now the thing is that this may work the 5th time, and it may work even the 15th time. What you and I ought to be worried about is that it may not work the 16th time or the 26th time. At some point, it's going to fail. It is a theorem in probability that, well, it's a very simple one, that if you have a non-zero probability for something, no matter how small, and an event is repeated again and again, and enough times, then that event will, that outcome will be achieved to within 1% or 0.5% or even less. So it is a calamity that is there, and it's for us to find ways of slowing down the nuclear race first, and then working towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. Today, it seems an awfully hard goal to achieve. And certainly, perhaps the thing that makes it most difficult is the United States. The US has now made nuclear weapons come back to center stage. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Nuclear Posture Review. That review, which was leaked to the press at the beginning of year 2002, states very explicitly that the US will use nuclear weapons against any country, whether that country has weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons included, or not. It also, for the first time ever, declares a strategy of using nuclear weapons to fight wars. Not as weapons of last resort, not as means of deterrence, as was the case during the Soviet time, but as weapons which will actually be used to fight wars. And logically, what followed from this is the development of new types of weapons. We now have the Congress okay research and development on bunker busters and deep earth penetration bombs and so forth. So when you look around at the world, you see that there is fear of nuclear weapons all around. And people are asking the question, look, the US went and attacked Iraq because it knew that the Iraqis did not have weapons of mass destruction. Not because it had, but because it didn't have. And compare that with North Korea, where the US is treating that with a great deal of respect. And it's likely that some kind of negotiations will resolve that crisis. It's very unlikely an invasion there. So this is a situation where people like us find ourselves in a great deal of difficulty. We see that nuclear weapons have regained prominence. On the other hand, our situation, the India-Pakistan situation, becomes more dangerous by the day. And don't be, for a moment, be misled by the present thaw in relations between our countries. That could just go back to its old state in a twinkling of the eye. Look, all that's needed is another occurrence like the 13th of December. And remember, it was, at least I believe, that 13th of December, the attack on the Indian Parliament, happened without the knowledge of General Musharraf and without the knowledge of the top people in the military in Pakistan. These were independent actors, and they could do it again. With the sort of hostility that exists between our countries, an event like this could just set everything not just back to where it was, but much beyond that. How much beyond? It's up. I mean, it's up for speculation. Furthermore, there is no change of heart. Yes, these are nice overtures which are being made. It's of course very good that that we have the bus link restored. It's very good that people are going across and that visas are being granted and that high commissioners have gone back to their embassies. All very fine, but our positions remain fixed. And as long as that remains, we will be in danger and the nuclear build-up will continue. There is no relenting on that. So the task before us is a very hard one, it's a very difficult one. But I think that we can make progress. We have to make progress because there's simply no alternative to that. And you see that when the doors to trade, to cultural exchange open, then there is born a possibility that we can jointly work out things, that we can then argue in public, we can prevail upon our governments, we can demonstrate, we can write, we can do various things to say, stop this madness, it's not getting us anywhere. So I'll stop here. I just want to say that it's wonderful being here with you, and I'm sure there are things in here that you didn't agree with. I'm also conscious of the fact that this was not a perfectly balanced film. I would have liked to have much more footage from India. I did try very hard, but it does come down a bit hard on Pakistan. Well, that's fine. It should come down a bit harder on India, I feel. That's as much as I could do. So, thanks.
Other than that, other than her usual activities, she is a professor of social and cultural anthropology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Her work has largely been on post-colonial social movements in India and towards enabling participatory democracy and social and ecological justice. She is working with issues of globalization, human rights, nationalism, sustainable development, ecological restoration, and some 10,000 other issues. And since September 11th, she has also convened the Dialogues for Peace at CIIS. So with that,
I want you alive.
you want to sit down?
No. It's better if I stand, isn't it? Yes. Why would you make it easier for me? That is the reason one shouldn't have friends. I firstly want to say what a pleasure it is to have met you today in person, and how much courage it takes to do what you did and to stand here and speak as you do. I have the greatest respect and admiration for that, so thank you. And to FOSA, which is a very important effort in the Bay Area, and I'm going to talk briefly about diaspora issues and how we as a people far away from home, with the same issues that still somehow course through our veins, how we might respond to some of the questions that you raised. But before that, the reason I wanted Richard beat up, do you think I should say it? It's iffy. But I started writing about human rights in South Asia, you know, and it was, but before I knew it, it was like 30 pages. And I told Richard, you know, these people have only given me 30 minutes, but I wanted to only talk for 20 minutes, and this can go on for hours and hours. So he kept chanting, you can tell these people to listen to you for 20 minutes, and after that, what is it you said?
Well, Fidel Castro is known for 12 to 15-hour speeches, so I was just saying, hail Fidel, hail Fidel. You can speak for 20 minutes and tell people you're going on for another 12 hours, but feel free to leave or have a samosa.
And I somehow felt that was not a flattering comparison, at least in that moment. Anyway, human rights, the individual, civil, political, workers' rights, the right to life and livelihood, to health care, to education, to freedom of expression as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other relevant treaties and conventions and national constitutions of peoples across South Asia. That is what we're here to talk about today. South Asia technically means Afghanistan, which sometimes belongs to South Asia and sometimes in Central Asia, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. It is a vast, vibrant, and contested terrain, the notion of human rights in those countries. I just got back from India a few days ago, and I went to work in Orissa, where the Hindu fundamentalist organizations in the last 2 years, they have instated 25,000 groups just in Orissa. After Gujarat, Narendra Modi gave a call saying Orissa was going to be one of these centers for cultural restoration of Hindutva. And as I talked to people and as I looked at who it is, the bodies of people on whom the imprint of violence, the fight between elites and nations and boundaries most leave their mark, it is terrifying to witness. Because it is women, it is Dalits, it is Adivasis, indigenous people, it is people who are poor, it is people who are disenfranchised, it is poor people who have nothing to do to participate or give consent to what you just witnessed. Yes. So on August 17, 2003, a few days after India and Pakistan celebrate 56 years of freedom, if I reflect on it just between those two countries, it's horrifying because it feels like freedom is something we desire so we can be rid of each other. Not so we can be closer to each other, not so we can make peace with history, but it is so we can be rid of each other. As I watched, I also went to the Narmada Valley in solidarity, where I watched people, 400,000 people to be displaced just by one large dam on a river. I watched the river where I had been before since 1989. It's beautiful, calm, Narmada. And it's become an ocean, it's wide. 12 people have been killed by crocodiles who are trapped. Siltation levels are rising. These are people who bathe in the river, they play, they fish. That's their life, right? They continue to do it. It's turned their most valuable resource into their most intimate enemy. And as I watch that, I think, whose freedom is it that we're talking about? Whose independence is it that we're talking about? Whose nation is it that we're talking about? For you and I, there's a stake condition. And I am one of those unpopular people who believe that India has a particular and special responsibility in South Asia. I believe that today, the status of Pakistan and India and their relationships and even the construction of Pakistan into a military democracy 56 years after independence, in part, is because of the way we conceived independence itself. It's not a very popular point, even amongst my sympathetic friends. Human rights in South Asia is mediated by state-crafted history, by nationalism and nation building. When I said whose nation is it, what does it mean? What is it that we're looking to do? We've inherited a country, right? And when I go to villages and I've asked my friends in Pakistan, human rights activists, and they tell me the same thing. Most people can't even conceive what the nation is. Their loyalties are to their village, are to their cultural groups, are to their families. It is a reality larger than ourselves. Arundhati Roy said something beautiful. She said it is as if the flag has shrink-wrapped our brain. And I think it has in part. The investment to nation cannot undermine investment to who we become as a people. And if you look at national choices in militarization, if you look at national choices in industrialization, if you look at national choices in development, it has systematically not brought us closer or unified India's slogan, unity in diversity. It has not brought us together. It has actually used our differences to exploit those against each other to create the fiction of a national identity that supersedes cultural, political, geopolitical identities that are far more precious to us. And it has been constructed by and large by a political elite. We have failed 56 years since independence to have democracy that functions for the masses. Democracy to the extent that it functions for us is not a big deal. Democracy to the extent that it functions within the Panchayati Raj, that it functions within the Dalit woman's home whose husband was made to eat in South India on rubber slipper deep dish shit. what his crime was? He had refused to survive to those who consider themselves pioneers. Human rights does not function in the context of a nation state. And I think that's very somber reckoning. It would be nice to come here and talk about pleasant things today. It would be nice, and there is a lot to celebrate. That we are here today is a wonderful thing to celebrate, isn't it? But the frightening thing is that when we give a call, we show up and we think that we are gathering strength. When the Sangh Parivar, the Hindu Brigade in the Bay Area gives a call, there are 10,000 people who show up, right? And I personally agree with the Gandhian strategy of building strength to challenge what is frightening for us, to challenge what is build power, to challenge power. And I think we have a long way to go, and there is a lot to celebrate. But there is also a lot of crisis that we need to confront. I wanted to read some of what I had written and talk a little bit and time myself. So how much? 15 minutes? The imagination, I wanted to talk a little about nationalism. The imagination and role of nation and nationalism is constructed along the fault lines of power, culture, history that determine belonging and unbelonging. Who is an insider, who is an outsider, who should we do away with? Colonialism and elite rule under post-coloniality, the creation of non-democratic mass movements, and the refusal of the elite to confront their own privilege are serious issues. The difference between dominant nationalism and the nationalism of disenfranchised peoples is incommensurate. Because for mass movements that are based for survival resources, the dreams from a nation, the expectations from a nation are radically different. If you look at Dalit movements, if you look at tribal movements, if you look at even factional movements, the dreams are for basic subsistence and basic livelihood. If you look at dominant movements, the dreams and aspirations are something much larger for an Islamic state, for a Hindu state, for a state that controls identities and manufactures it, and the dangerous intersection that we are approaching between globalization and communalism, between globalization and nation building. It is a struggle today to think beyond nationalist frames, to confront the realities of multicultural and multi-ethnic groups within and outside national boundaries. How then, that is a question I want to pose for us, how then do we think about alliances between states and federations, between peoples, and of the impact of history on how it is produced in the present?
About ABM, is that the same when what they're doing buy something from the US or Israel? I mean, just wasting money.
Well, you see, ABM has got a much bigger goal, which is that of providing protection to the US from ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Here we are talking of theater missile defense. So it would be medium-range missiles, IRBMs, which Pakistan has in its possession and India has to, and to provide protection against them. Now, you know, the Patriot system didn't do very well in the first Gulf War. In fact, it hit none of the targets. But now with the Patriot 2 system and with the Arrow system, the kill probability has gone up. And certainly technical refinements have made this possible. The more effective this ABM system is, the greater will be the fear that the other side has. So that's why this is so destabilizing. And actually, the Star Wars idea is a very grand one, which then takes the United States into the weaponization of space. Once you have control of outer space, then you have it all, because then you can fight wars from out there without losing any of your own. It goes much beyond Patriot and Arrow and so forth.
Very elegant. Thank you. I never heard anybody from Pakistan speak before, and I'm very impressed with all of your conclusions of I have only one question for you. And when you made your film, you made your film with Pakistan and India. You yoked Pakistan to India. It's much like yoke Mexico with America. Why did you leave out the China factor in the whole equation?
Stand up, maybe it's better so that I can see people at the back. Well, you know, because I feel that China is a reason that is used by India very often to justify its nuclear acquisitions. But in fact, China is peripheral to this. And let me tell you why. In 1948, the Indian Atomic Agency was set up. It came about because Homi Bhabha, who is an excellent scientist, physicist, had a very good rapport with Jawaharlal Nehru. And Nehru believed in science and technology and was a very forward-looking person, and it wasn't very hard for Bhabha to convince him of the need for India to go nuclear. Well, what does going nuclear mean? That was deliberately left ambiguous at that time. In fact, in 1955, Bertrand Russell, he writes this in his autobiography, he visits India and he meets both Bhabha and Nehru, and he takes a great liking to Nehru and a great dislike to Bhabha. He broaches the idea with them that why should India not sign? He argues to them, with them, saying that India should go for peaceful uses of nuclear energy only. And so definitely distance itself from the possibility of making a bomb. And Nehru was inclined to listen to him, but Bhabha completely rejected that out of hand. So the reason that I think bringing up China is not of immediate relevance is because, you see, India wanted the bomb a great deal before the 1962 war. And you know that relations between China and India have been very good. In fact, it was Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai all the way until that time. Why did India want the bomb? Well, because it was clear that the bomb brought with it prestige. And in fact, that is true to an extent. The fact that all 5 members of the Security Council are nuclear weapon states is an indication of that. That's why I leave out China. But of course, after the 62 war, India feels the imperative to actually start working on the bomb. 48 was the potential. 62, it starts moving ahead. 74, it tests. That's exactly when Pakistan starts its nuclear program. And then 98 is before us.
I think it's also important to look at what it's a fiction holding the country together. And I think an external proclivity to building strength, to sort of acquiring the big brother image, has facilitated India's capacity to hold itself together without addressing those issues inside its territory.
What you're saying is the construct itself is flawed.
Modern nation states, yes.
But then, in terms of a practical solution, you're not saying anything. In terms of something that you can do today, you're not saying anything.
If you ask me, I would. I think that there are various things that, in terms of practical solution, I think one is to support mass-based movements, not only grassroots movements, but also international coalitions. To reverse the onslaught of corporate globalization, because if you look at the defense industry and you look at globalization, they're extremely linked, yes? So to reverse the onslaught of certain forms of globalization, and B, to look at the nation perhaps as a federation of different communities rather than a construct that overrides the self-determination of those communities.
What I understood was if you're looking for an easy solution to Indian Pakistan, forget it. It's not going to happen.
It's not, no, I'm sorry. Wait, 5,000 years got us here, 50 years got us here. It's going to take a little while. Yes.
The international institutions like the United Nations were never terribly great at solving the problem to begin with. Could you comment on the role of that after March of this year, the marginalization of international?
It's March of last year, you mean Gujarat?
No, March of this year with the Iraq war and
Yes, yes, absolutely. I think the US, and perhaps you'd like to comment on it as well, I think the United States, it's sort of been United Nations by United States, you know. And I think that the role of the United States in financially backing these institutions has cut off the legs of these institutions. They are not independent, they are not powerful. And what happened in Iraq this time absolutely violated the premise of an international coalition of nations that function through some modicum of democratic process and law. Yes. So I think to revamp the United Nations or to think of alternate structures is also extremely essential. But to do that, to do that, one would have to also rethink who is at the political helm in India or Pakistan or China or wherever else. Because if you have the BJP in some power at the being able to resolve the crisis at the United Nations, that resolution would not be in the interest of the people. So I think that both a grassroots democracy that then allows the building of a certain kind of revolutionary consciousness that then facilitates international solidarity movements for democratic governments would be very important, and it's dangerous that the United States is the lone superpower.
Well, the only addition I'd like to make to that is that, look, even the US is finding it very hard to do it alone.
That's right.
They want India to come into Iraq, they want Pakistan to come, and fortunately, the two countries are going. It's not as yet. It just shows that even the US needs help from the rest of the world.
And we should refuse it.
And we should refuse it where it is illegitimate.
That's right.
I think that the damage that has been done to international law, to international institutions has been simply enormous. How this will be repaired and when it will be repaired is, I think, something that we'll have to see. For in one particular area, it has been devastating, but many areas it has been devastating. But consider the area of arms control. Now, in the context of India and Pakistan, you know, around January of 2000, because of President Clinton's persistent efforts to get India and Pakistan to sign the CTBT, both countries were inching towards doing that. And then, well, people in both countries, people at the top in both countries, said, hey, wait a minute, let's not do it. The US Senate is not going to ratify the CTBT. And so they held off, and indeed it was not ratified. And now the CTBT is gone, it's dead, it's finished. That's just one treaty. You look at the biological weapons convention. The US is not ratifying that. That's another arms control treaty gone. Now the biggest danger is that, I think it's a real danger, that the US will pull out of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. For one thing, it's already in violation of Article 6 of that. And for another, look, a country like Iran is perfectly respectful of the NPT. It's not only signed it, but it has no proven violation of that, although there are technicalities to be argued with over there. But if it should happen that Israel goes and bombs with US assistance or with US approval Iranian nuclear facilities, well, what does that mean? That means that that treaty carries no meaning whatsoever, that international treaties, even if a country signs that, they can be disrespected by the only power that matters. And so we are in real danger of sliding into a world of chaos. It's frightening. Then it's the only law which holds is that of state power.
It's also in Liberia, for example, the United States is not finding the going easy. You know, I think there was not only international violations, but also there were severe violations of consent in the United States itself. The anti-war, the movement against the war, that the United States government did not adhere to. And I think one of the things I talked about is a diaspora community, but one of the things systematically one would need to build is also to strengthen our solidarity with movements here. Because if we are going to have an ethical government in the United States, that as well as ethical governments in Pakistan and India, that would be extremely important. And the use of, for example, after Iraq, if you look at schools in minority areas, which are poor areas, if you look at schools on campuses, they would have recruitment set up. Army would come and they would say, you know, come and recruit, join the United States Army. Again, whose backs is the army built on? Who are the people fighting this war? Exactly. Who are people of color disproportionately? As well as, this is the country with the largest number of prison population. And among the largest number of prison population, it has, I think, 37% of its prison population are African Americans, when they're only African American men, when they're only 7% of the total population of the United States. So I think it would be very important to have that level of breakdown so we can build solidarity with the communities to say that by recruiting these people to the armed forces, you are not giving them the economic security, you are actually promising.
Question the appropriateness of democracy for our countries, given the footage that we saw on the tape, as well as some from personal experiences. It seems like, you know, if democracy was the mantra of the day, then, you know, our countries would be much more hawkish and, you know, hostile towards each other than they are today. It seems like we've seen some of that in the elections that were recently held in Pakistan and India as well. That, you know, in Hindu nationalists and Muslim extremists are gaining more and more popularity. So do you think it's appropriate for us to, you know, to be behind democracy and say, okay, this is the panacea for our problems, it's going to pull us out?
I want to ask how do you think there are an active participation and if they are, then why should your opinion be not more than the opinion of millions of families who voted and got this kind of share, even the majority got more back? Why is your opinion more faithful?
People also forget Hitler was elected.
Exactly.
It's a difficult question.
I think that there's a difference between, as Gramsci talked very eloquently, there's a difference between a mass base and building consciousness within a mass, so it is a mass-based struggle. So if one gets a mass to come together and to rape women, one does not see that as consensus in a democracy. Do you see what I mean? And I think those are very important distinctions to be made. And I think when you talk about democracy, the fabric of democracy is becoming increasingly narrowly defined, which is extremely both isolating and problematic for the countries. And I think democracy by advanced capitalism, perhaps democracy by Coca-Cola, for example, which, as you know, in India they're pumping arsenic into the water, as we just found out. But anyway, I think democracy by Coca-Cola probably needs to be rethought in terms of what would be a viable democratic ethos for a particular cultural context. And also keeping in mind that all of these societies are plural. In a certain sense, there might be a particular community that is in majority, but they are fundamentally all of them plural societies, and therefore one cannot simply say that we are also modern subjects. You know, one cannot simply say that we want to return to something, because the past often, if you are a member of a marginalized community, the past looks somewhat dim as well. And I think so, an excavation of democracy, rethinking of democracy so that it is mass-based rather than corporate or elite-based, that rethinking certainly needs to happen.
Well, I guess the real question is, what is democracy? If democracy means simply electing your leaders, then if you were to have free and fair elections in India and Pakistan at the present moment, perhaps we'd get precisely these very same people who are not enlightened, who have as their first priority the consolidation of their power. And in that sense, I think democracy is not a way out of our difficulties. But that's a very restrictive meaning to democracy that one gives. By democracy, one means the right of people to choose the form of their government, how they are governed, and to have control over their lives. And that, I know, is a broad statement, control over your life. But consider the fact that in our villages, in our urban slums, it really makes no difference at all who is the prime minister or who is the governor of the province. People have no control over their lives. There is no real content to democracy when you have the majority oppressed, impoverished, uneducated, illiterate. Then democracy, in the previous sense, the first sense I first defined, doesn't carry very much meaning, is not of very great benefit. So, in order to bring about that actual democracy, actual control of people's lives, that is the only way forward for us. Should that happen, I have no doubt whatsoever that people will reject militarism. It makes no sense. They will reject the idea that the two countries must be perpetually at war with each other. It's nonsense. What are we fighting over? If it's a question of territory, well, sure, of course, you can get people excited on that. But when you bring it down to how it affects them, how it takes away resources, and how, in fact, the problem is a much more complex one than they've been allowed to deal with, that takes away the whole drive towards militarism. And finally, just one thing. Public opinion is enormously manipulable. And you see that here in the United States, where you have supposedly a free media. And yet, it's a media that goes very much in one direction, in supporting the establishment.
It's also owned by corporations.
It's also owned by corporations. In our case, it is just as dangerous, perhaps even more. To take the Kashmir issue, for example. It's routine to raise passions on that. Pakistan television has this program after the 9 o'clock news. It's called Kashmir Quiz. All right, the questioner comes on. You are asked the question, how many houses were burnt by Indian security forces between 1999 and 2000? 7,000, 9,000, 11. How many women were raped between this year and that year? So many thousands, so many thousands. And then the announcer comes out and smiles and says the answer is A, the answer is B. And this sort of thing is a disgrace. And it actually has an impact. It gets people excited, emotional. And this is how you can manipulate democracy, and this is how you can make it essentially meaningless unless it is fought against. And that's why we must fight it.
And democracy, in one second, is also working at the grassroots. For example, in India, there's one movement where 64,000 villages are participating. And it is to get back control over nationalized forest lands, because democracy, as you said, would also mean self-determination. How does one have self-determination? By having access to livelihood resources, right? The right to life and livelihood. And they've decided that to have the right to life and livelihood, they need control over their resources. And they have seen that when the government has control over resources, they bring in, again, corporations, they mine them out, and these people, who are proud people on their land, become overnight bonded laborers, agricultural laborers, or are booted off into city slums. So there's a movement all across the country for land rights of disempowered communities to take control over livelihood resources. And the reason I bring it up is in Orissa, when I was here I was inquiring into, there are 8,000 villages in Orissa that are part of this movement. And you know, when the Sangh Parivar organizations go into these villages, nothing. Nothing. They cannot make an inroad. They cannot make an inroad because these are people organized around self-determination. They understand that each other and our relationships and our confrontations need to be resolved in a democratic fashion at the grassroots without the interventions of people who are telling you there are Christian missionaries trying to kill Hindus and there are Muslims trying to take away livelihood from someone else. So it's extremely effective where grassroots democracy functions. It's extremely effective as a deterrent to this kind of majoritarian nationalism that you're describing. Yes.